dear Professor De Soto, distinguished guests, dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mihai Vladimir Topan, and I am a member of the International Business and Economics Department within the Academy of Economic Studies, and a member of the Romanian Society for Economics, SOREC, our hosts here tonight. I am also, and honored to be so, President of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, Romania, under the auspices of which the Romanian translation of Professor Huerta de Soto's book has been undertaken and accomplished. More specifically, it has been done through the efforts of Diana Costea, who is unfortunately no longer with us, and Tudor Smirna, here present, both of them former students of this institution of higher economic learning. I would like to invite the latter, Tudor Smirna, to introduce to you briefly the book that Professor De Soto has launched and is launching in Bucharest today. And of course, our guest speaker tonight, Professor Jesus Huerta de Soto. Tudor, please.
Thank you. Honorable audience, I am very pleased to be here today making this laudatio for Professor Jesus Huerta de Soto. Professor Jesus Huerta de Soto is PhD in Economic Science and PhD in Law from the Complutense University of Madrid. He is also a mathematical actuary and holds a Stanford MBA. He is a member of the Mont Pelerin Society, of the Royal Economic Society of London, the American Economic Association, and the Spanish, Portuguese, Swiss Associations of Actuaries. He was awarded the King Juan Carlos International Prize for Economics in Madrid in 1993, the Adam Smith Award in Brussels in 2005, the Franz Kuhl Memorial Prize for Excellence in Economic Education in Prague in 2006, the Gary Schlarbaum Prize for Liberty in Salamanca last year in 2009. He was named Doctor Honoris Causa for Social Sciences by the Francisco Marroquin University in Guatemala, also in 2009. And he will be awarded the Doctor Honoris Causa title on Friday by the Alexandru Ioan Cuza University in Iași. Since 2000, he has been Professor of Political Economy at the King Juan Carlos University in Madrid. Huerta de Soto is currently considered as one of the most representative exponents of the Austrian School of Economics. He has published numerous research works and articles on subjects related to his specialty. I have already said that Professor Huerta de Soto is currently considered as one of the most representative exponents of the Austrian School of Economics. Let me elaborate on this statement very shortly. There are three things, among others, that I consider recommend Professor Huerta de Soto. His uncompromising intellectual stance, his written work, and his vivid style of lecturing. This latter part, I'm sure, will be demonstrated in action in a very short while by the man himself, thus allowing me to make just a short mention of the book that we launched today. The treatise on money, it's called in Romanian Moneda, Creditul Bancar și Ciclurile Economice. You have it there on the table. Is a remarkable effort to explain the misguided institution of fractional reserves and the plea for the return of traditional legal principles in banking. It is a best-selling success that has been translated until now in 13 languages. In the end, I want to mention Diana Costea, to whom we owe the Romanian translation of this book. She was a very promising scholar in the Austrian tradition. She was also a great character, a moral and compassionate friend. She dedicated a huge part of the last years of her short life to the Romanian Ludwig von Mises Institute and also to her academic career. While she was working as an assistant professor and on her doctoral thesis, Diana also acted as executive director, seminar coordinator, secretary, courier, and whatnot for the Mises Institute. And also, she began translating in 2006 the monetary treatise of Professor Huerta de Soto. Those of us who remember her permanent state of benevolent diligence are certain that she would have finished this project as she was doing everything else, thoroughly, quietly, and on time. Unfortunately, in the spring of 2007, her illness gave the first signs and the translation went slower and slower. However, until the Easter day of 2008, when she left us, she has accomplished a great deal of the translation. In her illness, she was stronger than her close ones, always with a smile and heartening words. In one of her few moments of sadness, she manifested her regret of parting with this world without leaving something behind. Well, to me, this brick of a book does look as quite something. I'm sure that the success of the Romanian version of this book will be in a good part due to her effort and will stand as a witness of Diana's contribution to the dissemination of ideas in the ideas of the Austrian School of Law and Economics in Romania. I now return to our guest and ask my colleague Vlad Topan to make the announcement of the prize that the Mises Institute is honored to offer him today. Thank you.
I will be very brief, but I don't want to miss this opportunity, and cannot miss it, of course, to invite Professor Jesus Huerta de Soto to become honorary member of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, Romania. Professor. Professor, the floor is yours.
The water closer. Good evening to everybody. I, first of all, would like to thank you very much to all of you for being here today to hear me, and especially to the Academia de Studii Economice for inviting me to deliver this lecture in this wonderful room, and also to the President of the Mises Institute for this great honor, and of course to Tudor Smyrna. My presentation will take around 1 hour, and I plan to divide it in 2 different parts. In the first part, I will lecture about the impossibility of socialism, which I think that at this moment is something quite obvious, especially to all of you that have been living in this country, formerly a country of the Soviet influence. But anyhow, I think it is important that we review why socialism it is impossible and the way we are still living in a socialist world. And the second part of my lecture will be about the current financial crisis and economic recession, which I consider to be just a specific case, an illustration of my general theory on the impossibility of socialism. So I would like that this is considered by all of you as a lecture, as a class on economic theory. And I do, again, consider it is a great honor to have the opportunity to teach you today what I know on these matters. Well, in the book that I have just published by the editor Edward Elgar in England and the United States, entitled Socialism, Economic Calculation and Entrepreneurship. It is precisely this book, and I hope that it will also soon be published, translated into Romanian, if it is possible. I explain in theoretical terms what socialism is and why it is an intellectual error, or better, a scientific impossibility. In my book, I show why socialism collapsed and why the socialism which still exists in the form of economic intervention in Western countries is the main source of the tensions and conflicts we experience in our everyday life. We still live in a world which is essentially socialist, despite the fall of the Berlin Wall. And we continue to suffer the effects which, according to economic theory, are typical of a state intervention in social life. So now, first of all, we must define socialism. And to define socialism, we must first understand the concept of entrepreneurship. Economic theorists conceive, especially economic theorists of the Austrian school, conceive entrepreneurship as the innate human ability. I'm not referring, when I am talking about entrepreneurship, I'm not referring to the typical entrepreneur who gets a business off the ground. Of course, he's an entrepreneur. But I'm referring to something deeper. I'm referring to that innate ability of all human beings to discover, create, and recognize the profit opportunities which arise in their environment, and to act accordingly to take advantage of them. In fact, etymologically speaking, the word entrepreneur comes from the Latin verb in prehendo, prehendi, prehensum, which means, in Latin, means to see, to grasp, to discover. And it evokes the discoverer, someone who realizes something and grasps it. It is the light bulb that lights up when you discover a profit opportunity. And I don't know how do you say entrepreneur in Romanian, but very probably it has the same root. Okay. Entrepreneurship, then, is humankind's primary capacity. It's the ability to create, to discover goals and means. And this is what, by nature, most distinguishes us from the animals. In this general sense, humans, all of us, are more homo empresario, more than homo sapiens. Who then is the entrepreneur? For instance, Mother Teresa of Calcutta. I'm not talking merely about Henry Ford, Bill Gates, who have been most certainly great entrepreneurs in the area of business. Every person with a creative, revolutionary vision is an entrepreneur. For instance, the mission of Mother Teresa was to help the most needy, and she sought the means to accomplish it in a creative way by pushing and harmonizing the efforts and wishes of many different people. Mother Teresa de Calcutta was a paradigmatic example of an entrepreneur. So let us view entrepreneurship as the most intimate characteristic of our nature as human beings, a quality responsible for the emergence of society as an extremely complex network of interactions. These consist of exchange relationships between people, and we establish them because we somehow realize that they benefit us. And our entrepreneurial spirit is the driving force behind them all, behind this social process. Every entrepreneurial act involves three stages, three important steps. The first stage consists of the creation of information. When an entrepreneur discovers or creates a new idea, he or she generates in his mind information which did not exist before. Then this information is, and this is the second stage, is transmitted in successive waves all around the market. Here I see a cheap resource which is poorly used. And there I discover an urgent need for precisely that same resource. I buy cheap and sell dear. I transmit information in the market. The information I transmitted is, please keep this resource because there is demand for it. And to the other person, you can go ahead with your action because the resource you were lacking is now available. Finally, and this is the most important, the third stage. In this third stage, economic agents who previously were acting in a discoordinated manner learn to act in a coordination way. They discover that they should save the resource because someone else needs it. And those are the three stages which complete the process: creation of information, transmission of information, and most importantly, the effect of coordination or adjustment. From the time we wake up in the morning until the time we go to bed at night, we discipline our behavior in terms of the needs of others, of people we even never meet. And we do this motu proprio, because when we act in our own entrepreneurial self-interest, we realize that this is to our advantage. It was very important for me to present this idea first, because now, in contrast, we will be able to understand more easily the true nature of socialism. Socialism must be defined as any system of institutional, methodical aggression against the free exercise of entrepreneurship. This is the true definition of socialism. Socialism consists of a forcible imposition using all the coercive means of the state. A socialist regime may place certain objectives in a positive light, but it will have to impose them and thus aggressively interfere with the process of social coordination which entrepreneurs spearhead. Therefore, in a socialist system, the state always acts using coercion. And this is the main characteristic of socialism. It is very important to keep this in mind, because socialists always will wish to conceal their coercive nature, which is the essential feature of their system. Coercion consists of the use of violence to force someone to do something. And there are two types of coercion. That of the criminal who robs people in the streets, for instance, and that of the state, the sort of which characterizes socialism. In the case of the asystematic coercion of the criminal, the market has mechanisms to provide, as far as possible, a definition of property rights and defense against crime. However, in the case of systematic institutional coercion by a state, with all the tools of power at its disposal, we have very little hope of avoiding it or defending ourselves against it. It is then that socialism reveals its true essence in all its harshness. I am not defining socialism based on whether ownership of the means of production is public or private. This is an archaism. The essence of socialism is coercion, institutional state coercion, by which a governing body is meant to perform the tasks necessary to coordinate society. The responsibility passes from ordinary people who are in charge of their entrepreneurship, seek ends and attempt to create the circumstances most favorable to achieving them, to a government body which from above strives forcibly to impose its particular view of the world or its particular objectives. Moreover, in my definition of socialism, the issue of whether or not the governing body has been democratically elected is entirely irrelevant. The theory of the impossibility of socialism remains intact and totally unchanged, regardless of whether the governing body, which tries to forcibly impose the coordination of society, is or is not of democratic origin. Now that I have defined socialism, I will explain why it is an intellectual error. And socialism is an intellectual error because the governing body, the authorities in charge of exercising coercion to coordinate society, cannot possibly obtain the information they need to give its commands a coordinating effect. This is precisely the reason why socialism is not possible. That is the problem of socialism. That it's its great paradox. The socialist leaders, the authorities, require information, knowledge, data for its desired coercive outcome, the organization of society, to be successful. But the authorities can never obtain such information. Mises and Hayek, the theorists of the Austrian School of Economics, formulated 4 basic arguments during the 20th century debate with the theorists of neoclassical economics, who were never capable of understanding the problem posed by socialism. Why were they incapable of understanding it? Why mainstream neoclassical economists never understood the challenge that socialism poses? The answer is that these theorists believe the economy works as it is explained in most first-year economics textbooks. However, and I'm sorry to say this here, what is explained in first-year economic textbooks concerning the working of a market economy is radically incorrect and false. The writers of these textbooks explain the market in terms of mathematics and perfect coordination. That is, they portray the market as a sort of a computer device which automatically and perfectly coordinates the desires of consumers and the action of producers in such a way that the ideal model is that of perfect competition, as described, for instance, by Walras' system of simultaneous equations. I will never forget my first economics class as a student at the University of Madrid on October 1973. My teacher, my professor, began with the following surprising statement. He said, and I quote, "Let us suppose that all the information is given." And then he began to fill the blackboard with functions, curves, formula. That is the supposition neoclassicals use, that all information is given and constant, either in certain or probabilistic terms. How stupid I was that day. I should have stand up and say, "Hey, your assumption is entirely realistic and stupid, professor." But of course, being the first day in the university, I didn't dare to say anything. This assumption contradicts the most typical characteristic of the market. The information is never given. Because knowledge and data emerges continually as a result of the creative activity of entrepreneurs who constantly create new ends, new means. Thus, the assumption cannot provide the basis for a valid economic theory. Neoclassical economists thought socialism was possible because they assumed that all of the data necessary to formulate the system of equations and necessary to find the solution of the problem were already given. They were unable to perceive the real-world events. They should have researched scientifically. In fact, I'm sorry to say that the majority of my colleagues could not see what was really happening in the world around them. Only the Austrian school, led by Ludwig von Mises, followed an entirely different paradigm. Austrians never assumed information to be given. They view the economic process as one driven by entrepreneurs who continually change and discover new information. Only members of the Austrian school managed to realize that socialism was an intellectual error. They grounded their position on 4 arguments that I'm now going to explain briefly. 2 arguments that we could say are static, and 2 additional arguments that we could define as dynamic. The first argument asserts that for reasons of volume, the authorities cannot possibly obtain the information it needs, or they need, to give it their commands a coordinating effect. Human beings handle an immense volume of information, and what 7 billion people have in their minds cannot possibly be managed. The neoclassical economists might be able to understand this argument, but this argument is the weakest, is the least important. After all, the computer capacity available to us nowadays permits us to process immense volumes of information. The second argument is much more profound and convincing. The information people work with in the market is not objective. It's not like the information printed in a book or in the telephone book. Entrepreneurial information is of a radically different nature. It is subjective, not objective. It is tacit, not explicit. In other words, we know something, the know-how. We are able to get a know-how. But we do not know in detail what it consists of, the know that. To put it in another way, it is like information on how to ride a bicycle. A person could try to learn to ride a bicycle by studying the formula of mathematical physics in a book, which expresses the equilibrium the cyclist maintains when he pedals. However, the knowledge necessary to ride a bicycle is not obtained in this way, but through a learning process which usually contains setbacks, but which eventually enables the rider to experience a sense of equilibrium on a bicycle and teaches him that he must lean to one side in the curves to avoid falling. In all probability, Lance Armstrong, you know who Lance Armstrong is? In all probability, I say, Lance Armstrong is unfamiliar with the laws which enable him to win the Tour of France 7 times. But he knows, of course, how to ride a bicycle. Tacit information is the entrepreneurial information and cannot be expressed in a formalized, objective manner, nor can it be transferred anywhere, much less to a governing body, to a ministry, or to the authorities. And remember, only univocal information, which does not lend itself to misunderstanding, is the only one that can be transmitted to the authorities, so that the governing body is able to assimilate it and to use it in the coercion of society, trying to give coordinating quality to its commands. But nevertheless, most of the information upon which the success of our lives depends is not objective. It is not like the information, again, printed in the telephone book, but it is subjective, tacit information. And this is the second argument of why socialism is an intellectual error, a scientific impossibility. Still, these 2 arguments, that the information is huge in volume and also of a tacit nature, are not enough. 2 other arguments do exist, which are dynamic and much more convincing as well. And they highlight the impossibility of socialism making it crystal clear. Human beings are endowed with an innate creative capacity. We constantly are able to discover new things, new ends, new means. Obviously, information or knowledge that entrepreneurs have not yet created or discovered can hardly be transmitted to the authorities. But the authorities are determined to build a social nirvana through coercion and the official state gazette. However, to do so, they must know what will happen tomorrow. But what will happen tomorrow will depend on entrepreneurial information which has not yet been created today, and thus cannot be transmitted today, in order to allow the authorities to coordinate as effectively tomorrow. This is precisely the paradox of socialism, the third argument. But however, this is not all. There is a fourth argument, which is definitive. By its very nature, remember, socialism is based on coercion. It is based on coercion on civil society as a whole. By its very nature, when the authorities do coerce the people, they block, hamper, or render impossible precisely where the coercion affects society. And to the extent that it affects society, the entrepreneurial creation of the information, which is precisely what the authorities need to issue coordinating commands. So the coercion blocks the creative capacity of the information that is precisely what our authorities do need. This is the explanation of socialism's theoretical impossibility in scientific terms. The authorities cannot acquire the information they need to give their commands a coordinating quality. And this is a purely scientific and objective analysis. We should not think the problem of socialism is that bad people are in power, are in the Romanian government now, the bad people, and if we change the bad people by the good people, things will improve. No, you are entirely wrong. Not even the best person in the world that you could imagine, with the best intentions and the greatest human knowledge, could organize a society according to the coercive socialist model. He would make it a hell, since given human nature, it is impossible to achieve the socialist ideal. Succumbing to socialism, because its ideal tempts us. Why? Because humans rebel many times against their own nature. To live in a world with an uncertain future disturbs us. The possibility of controlling that future or eradicating uncertainty attracts us. In The Fatal Conceit, the book written by Hayek writes that socialism is actually the social, political, and economic manifestation of humankind's original sin. Do you know what is humankind's original sin? Pride, the sin of pride. We are tempted to be God, or like God, to believe we are omniscient, we could know everything. So therefore, generation after generation, we will have to persistently guard us against socialism and accept that our nature is creative and entrepreneurial. Socialism is not simply a matter of acronyms or of political parties in a specific historical context or country. It will always seep furtively into communities, families, neighborhoods, and no matter if they are conservative or liberal or socialist parties. And we must resist that temptation towards estatism, because it is the most original danger we face as human beings. Our greatest temptation to believe we are God. We want to be like God is the temptation to Eve. The socialist considers himself overcoming this problem of radical ignorance, which fundamentally discredits his social system. So socialism is always a result of the sin of intellectual pride, of fatal conceit. Within every socialist, there lies a pretentious person, a prideful that wants to impose his views on the rest of the citizens. Additionally, socialism has some other characteristics we could call peripheral, but also of great importance. For instance, socialism creates social discoordination and disorder. The pure entrepreneurial act coordinates, as we have seen, but socialism distorts it through coercion, and so is the cause of social discoordination. The entrepreneur realizes a profit opportunity. He buys cheap and sells dear. He transmits information and coordinates the behavior of the people implicated. Two people who initially act against their perspective interests now, without realizing it, act in a coordinated or adjusted manner. But if socialism forcibly prevents this exchange, this entrepreneurial action, it causes widespread maladjustment. To top it all, when socialists observe the maladjustment they precisely have created, the discoordination, the conflict, and the worsening of the problem, far from reaching the reasonable conclusion we have presented, imagine what happened. They demand more socialism, more institutional coercion, to try to solve the problems they previously created. And we enter in a process in which problems, rather than being solved, worsen indefinitely and produce yet further increases in the weight of the state. The socialist ideal requires that the tentacles of the state reach every gap in society, and it triggers a process which leads always to totalitarianism. Another characteristic of socialism is its lack of rigor. Criteria are tried and changed. Problems are observed to worsen, and a new political direction is taken, and thus coercion is erratic. Why? Why is that? Because the effects of interventionist measures usually have very little resemblance to the effects originally sought. For instance, the minimum wage is intended to raise the standard of living of the people. What is its result? More unemployment and more poverty. Who are the worst hit? Social groups which are entering the labor market for the first time. For instance, you, the young people, women, ethnic minorities, immigrants. Another example, a common agricultural policy is designed through subsidies or political prices, and the European Union is flooded with agricultural products that cannot be sold. The consumer pays higher prices, and poor countries all over the world are placed at a very disadvantaged position because international markets are filled with the surplus products from the European Union at prices with which they cannot compete. In addition, socialism acts as a sort of a drug, like the opium. Socialism, in fact, is the opium of the people, not religion. Socialism, precisely. It generates, we'll see in a few minutes, overall malinvestment, because it distorts the signs which indicate where investments should be made if the desires of the consumers are to be satisfied. Socialism exacerbates problems of scarcity and provokes the systematic irresponsibility of governments because it is impossible to acquire the information necessary to know the true costs of every governmental decision. The authorities can only act willfully and leave a record of their mere wishes in the official state gazette. However, as Hayek asserts, those regulations put in the official state gazettes are not law in capital letters, but mere legislation or rules which are usually excessive and useless, even when they are claimed to be based on objective data and criteria. Lenin held that the entire economy should be organized like the postal service, and that the most important department in a socialist system should be the National Institute of Statistics. By the way, the word statistics derives etymologically from the word state. Therefore, it is a term we must be very cautious of if we wish to avoid socialism. It is a very suspicious concept, that of statistics, and I'm very sorry for the professors of statistics being here today. Remember that Jesus, but not me, the important guy, Jesus, was born in Bethlehem because the Roman emperor had ordered a statistical study concerning taxes, how much he could tax to all the heads of the empire. The first duty of every libertarian should be to request the elimination of the National Institute of Statistics. This is the first entity we should eliminate. I will talk about the second afterwards, which is the central bank, as a matter of fact. So since we cannot keep the state from doing harm, let us at least blindfold it so that the damage will occur more at random when the state errs, because they lack any kind of statistics. Socialism also plainly exerts a terrible effect on the environment. The only way to protect the environment is to define property rights clearly and to defend them effectively. No one rings someone else's doorbell, ding dong, and then when you open the door, you throw garbage in his face. No one do that. This only happens in common areas. An old Spanish saying goes, lo que es del común es del ningún, we say in Spanish. Or in English, what belongs to everyone belongs to no one. This is the tragedy of the commons, first described by Ludwig von Mises in 1940. Whether it be polluted water, disappearing schools of fish, or the extinction of the elephants, is always the result of a state restriction on the property rights required by a market economy. For instance, there is hunting where mountain land is privatized, but not where it is publicly owned. And elephants survive where they have been privatized. Fighting bulls in my country, and I am the grandson of a famous bullfighter, still exist precisely because bullfighting entrepreneurs look after them. The only way to preserve the environment is through a market economy, a capitalist system which implies well-defined property rights. Where these principles disappear, the environment suffers. English rivers are privatized, for example. They are clean, and there is fishing in them. Members of different fishing clubs, cheap, expensive, or moderate, fish in them. But try to find fishes in the Spanish public rivers. I don't know about the Romanian rivers. And there is also a typical effect of socialism, which is corruption, because socialism always corrupts. Those who have experienced the socialist economies which hid behind the Berlin Wall became aware of the huge lie that whole world represented. And let us not rest on our laurels now and think that we have overcome this problem, that the huge lie has no power here. When I say here, I do not refer precisely to Romania, I refer to the whole Western world. It is still present, of course, in different degrees. Because why does socialism corrupt? For several reasons. I would like to elaborate a little bit. First of all, coerced people in a socialist system quickly realize that in order to reach their goals, it is more effective for them to devote their effort and ingenuity to influence the authorities, rather than seeking opportunities to make a profit and to serve the other citizens. This is the origin of special interest groups, groups of vested interests, which strive to influence the decisions of the authorities. The socialist government body attracts all sorts of perverse, corrupting influences like a magnet. It also sets in motion a struggle for power. When the socialist model predominates, the issue of who is in power, whether it is someone from my group or not, is vital, is of vital importance. A socialist society is always very politicized. Not like in Switzerland, for instance, where people most likely do not know the name of the defense minister or even of the president of the government. In fact, in Switzerland, it does not even matter to the people who is in the government. The question of who is in power is not crucial for their lives. But in Spain, it's crucial for our lives. And everyone wants to change the current government politician by the representative of my party. It's like the Real Madrid and the Barça. Left party, or we both following those instincts. Human beings should dedicate most of their efforts to living successful lives without this sort of intervention. This process of a struggle for power, of interventionism, provokes a gradual change in man's habits of moral behavior. People manifest behavior that is increasingly amoral, or better, immoral, and less subject to principles. Our behavior becomes more and more aggressive. The goal is to gain power so we can impose our wishes on others. This also applies mimetically to the behavior of individuals. And consequently, we discipline our behavior less and less, and disregard the customary framework of moral laws. Morality is the automatic pilot of freedom. Thus, the above serves as another example of the corrupting influence of socialism in our lives. Furthermore, the more prevalent socialism is, the more the underground economy or black market develops. However, as people in the countries of the Eastern Europe used to say, and you are one of those countries, in the former days of real socialism, in many cases, the underground economy was not the problem, but the solution to the problems. Still, obviously, interventionist governments cannot simply accept all of this criticism, so they resort to political propaganda. It is claimed that the state detects every problem in time and solves it immediately. Again and again, political propaganda is systematically disseminated in the TV, radio, in all spheres, in an attempt to deflect criticism. And as a consequence, a culture of the state is created, a culture which bewilders and disorients the citizenry, who come to believe that when faced with any problem, the state will take care of everything. And this strictly socialist way of thinking is passed down from one generation to the next generation through the education system, which of course is always controlled by the state. And I'm sorry to say this here in a state university. But very honored of the freedom of speech of being able to say that here. And propaganda leads to megalomania. Bureaucratic organizations, public officials, politicians are not subject to a profit and loss statement. For them, poor management does not mean expulsion from the market. Authorities and public officials are only accountable to a budget and a set of regulations, and every 4 years to some general elections. There is no personal malice involved, at least not necessarily. Believe it or not, politicians are like any one of us. But in the institutional environment in which they live, their actions are perverse and corrupted. Even me, named ministry of the Romanian government, would be corrupted. I would say the Spanish government, of course, also. Their activity within the state leads them to request more public officials and a larger budget, and to assert that their work is vital. Can you imagine of a single public official, politician or bureaucrat, who after a profound analysis has arrived at the conclusion that the corresponding agency for which he works is useless or entails costs which exceed the benefit it provides to society? A single individual who has proposed that his government, to his government just to eliminate the corresponding budget item? Not one in the history of humankind, in any country. On the contrary, in all contexts, in all governments, in all countries, each official invariably considers his own role in the state as vital. Socialism is megalomaniac and infects all of society with this quality. For instance, culture, transformed into cultural policy, is one example. And it was defined by a very distinguished representative of the European Union, who was also head of the Spanish Ministry of Culture. I will not say his name, as follows. Our government policy for culture is the following. Lots of public money, lots of parties for the young people of rock, and awards, prizes for our friends. This is the cultural policy of my country and of every country. In addition, socialism leads to the prostitution of the concepts of law and justice. Law, in the classical view, is simply a set of abstract, substantive rules or laws which are generally applied equally to all. Justice consists of judging whether or not individual behaviors have been in keeping with this framework of objective and abstract laws, material laws. That's what lawyers say. These are blind. So now we understand why justice has traditionally been portrayed like a goddess blindfolded. If you read the Bible, in Leviticus 19:15, you can read the following quote: "Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality, neither to the poor, nor favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbors fairly." So equally dangerous that being in favor of the rich, equally dangerous is to be partial toward the poor people. Because justice must be blind and apply the laws without looking at specific results. The moment we violate general legal principles, even if we do so for a good cause, because, for instance, we are moved by the eviction for unpaid rent of a widow, or because a minor theft in a large department store will have no significant effect on the income of the company involved, or any example you could imagine, we do a terrible damage to justice. Judges who act in this way, who neglect to apply the law in a general way, in a blind way, fall prey to the fatal error of intellectual conceit, of believing themselves to be gods. They replace the law with their impression of the particular circumstances of the case, and they open the door to those goals, to the goal of trying to move the judges. You can see the American movies with the jury system. Is everyone in those movies interested in law? Lawyers, all the system is only interested in impressing the members of the jury. And when the final decision of the judge can be either one or the other, depending on your ability to impress the judge, the result is completely arbitrary. Every sue can be either successful or not, depending on the lack or ability you have to try to convince the judge, to move the judge or the members of the jury. So what happens? All legal certainty entirely disappears, and justice is entirely corrupted. Of course, when you ask for a solution of the problem to the agents involved in the judicial system, you know what they will ask for? Imagine. They will ask for more resources, more budget, more judges, more public officials. They never will attack the real cause of the problems. And again, when I am making this analysis of the judicial system, I'm not referring specifically to the Romanian system, but my own country and the other Western countries, with only small differences of degree. Ultimately, the most perverse effect of socialist corruption is the mimetic influence it exerts on the sphere of individual moral actions. To people of good faith, socialism is very attractive. If there are problems, the state will provide the necessary resources and impose a solution to help, for instance, the poor people. Who could oppose the achievement of such a worthwhile, praiseworthy goal? The problem is the ignorance which lies at the heart of this argument. The state cannot know what it would need to know to act in this manner. The state of God, of course, is not God, even if some members of the state do consider themselves to be God. By the way, this was the nickname of our former Prime Minister. Among the members of our government, they were referring by the mobile phone. God has said that, God will go tomorrow to that meeting, God will say, that was the nickname of our Prime Minister. You know why? You can imagine. And this belief that we can do whatever we want disturbs the entrepreneurial process and aggravates the problems. Instead of acting automatically and according to dogmatic principles which are the subject of law, the state acts arbitrarily. And that is what most demoralizes and corrupts society. For instance, I will mention now the illegal battle fought against terrorists, the ETA terrorists in Spain for some years ago, of course. This provides the perfect example. It was a colossal mistake. Principles are not an obstacle which prevents us from achieving desired results, but the only road which can lead us to them. As the English proverb teaches us, the English proverb says, quote, honesty is always the best policy. Honesty is a principle which should always be followed, especially when you don't know what the final result is going to be. And this is here precisely where socialism fails. For in the socialist model, for choosing the best combination of means and ends, the leaders play God. And it is through that persecution of the optimal, most efficient course of action that should be followed according to the authorities, irrespective of moral principles. Socialism is not only an intellectual error, but is also a truly antisocial force, because its most intimate characteristic consists of its coercive restriction, as I said, of the entrepreneurial freedom of the citizens, in its creative and coordinating capacity. And this freedom is humanity's distinguishing attribute. Socialism is an unnatural social system which conflicts with man's true nature and aspirations. And I would like to mention here the encyclical letter, Centesimus Annus, that the late Pope John Paul II wrote. In this encyclical letter, when the late Pope was considering whether capitalism is the social system most compatible with human nature, he writes, if by capitalism is meant an economic system which recognizes the fundamental and positive role of business, the market, private property, and the resulting responsibility for the means of production, as well as free human creativity in the economic sector, then the answer is certainly in the affirmative. Only capitalism is compatible with human nature. It seems as this paragraph has been written not by the late Pope John Paul II, but by Hayek. Nevertheless, immediately the Pope adds a but, I'm not referring to greedy capitalism. Why this but? Because the Pope spent his life warning of the effects of the unbridled capitalism, detached from moral, ethical, and legal principles. But if we take into account that what is reprehensible is egoism, immorality, and so on. True capitalism as a social system is neutral at worst, and at best, in fact, is a system of voluntary exchanges that promotes morality, the distinction between good and evil, as opposed to the moral corruption, which always accompanies, goes hand by hand with socialism. And finally, whatever happened to socialism? Has it failed? Has it disappeared? Has it vanished into the thin air? No. Oh, let us be a little bit more optimistic. Yes and no. That certainly has been the fate of the so-called real socialism. But our societies are still deeply inside the socialist ideal. The differences between the so-called left-wing and right-wing parties are only differences of degree. For instance, Spain did make some progress between 1996 and 2004 in the area of freedom under the leadership of the right-wing Popular Party. First came the abolition of that 20th century form of slavery, the compulsory military service. Military service became voluntary, and that is of vital importance. Incidentally, may I mention that the Socialist Party opposed this? Second, there was a timid tax cut. And then the principles of a balanced budget was adopted in my country. And some liberalization and privatization occurred. It was not really much to get excited about. But we must remember that the vast majority of the 12 million voters of the Popular Party, right-wing party, in fact were socialists. Most of the people wanted the state to solve all their problems. Not much else could be done. Now the mission falls to us, the university professors, the young people, the students, the intellectuals, the honest intellectuals, and the second-hand dealers of ideas working at journals, TV, radio, and so on. We are responsible for gradually changing the spirit of the times, especially among the young, who are willing to take to the streets boldly to defend their ideas. Today, socialism continues to prevail. Between 40 and 50% of the gross domestic product of the countries in the modern Western world is in the hands of the government. Our only hope lies, as always, in the power of ideas and in the intellectual honesty of the young. Thank you very much. Well, I was asking permission to the chairman in their opinion about if you wanted that I continue with my special view about the current financial crisis and economic recession. They told me that, of course, any one of you that wants to leave could go away, but considering that this is a unique opportunity and very probably I will not be back here in many years, I think I must give you at least a brief summary of my view on the current economic recession. If you agree with that. So I will concentrate now on the past financial crisis and the current worldwide economic recession. It's one of the most challenging problems we must now cope with. Because having witnessed the intellectual and practical defeat of socialism, especially during the last decades of the 20th century, 20 years ago here in Romania, in my opinion, the main challenge that still remains for the future of capitalism is the urgent need to privatize money by dismantling the organ of central monetary planning, the so-called central bank. In other words, real socialism, represented by state money, central banks, and financial administrative regulations, is still in force in the monetary and credit sectors of the so-called free market economies. As a result of this fact, we experience regularly in the area of money and credit all the negative consequences established by the theorem of the impossibility of socialism discovered by those distinguished members of the Austrian School of Economics, who I mentioned, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. Specifically, the central planners of state money are unable to know, to follow, and to control the changes in both the demand and supply of money. Furthermore, the whole financial system is based on the legal privilege given by the state to private bankers to act with a fractional reserve ratio in relation with the demand deposits they receive from their clients. As a result of this privilege, private bankers are not true financial intermediaries, but are mainly creators of deposits that do materialize in credit expansions, in artificial credit expansions. And these credit expansions are artificial in the sense that they do not correspond to any previous increases in the voluntary savings of the citizens. In this way, the current fractional reserve banking system is the instrument used to create, worsen, and amplify the systematic intertemporal distortions and investment misallocations that the macroeconomic planners working for central banks induce in the production structure of the whole real economy. These distortions manifest themselves in the stages of financial bubbles, economic boom, euphoria, overall malinvestment, and afterwards the stages of financial crisis and deep economic recession and unemployment. The expansionary cycle, which has now come to a close, was set in motion when the American economy emerged from its last recession in 2001, and the Federal Reserve embarked again on a major artificial expansion of credit and investment, an expansion that was not backed by a parallel increase in voluntary household savings. For many years, the money supply in the form of banknotes and demand deposits has grown at an average rate of over 10% per year, which means that every 7 years, the total volume of money circulating in the world has doubled. The media of exchange originating from this severe fiduciary inflation have been placed on the market by the banking system as newly created loans granted at extremely low interest rates, even negative in real terms. And this has fueled a speculative bubble in the shape of a substantial rise in the prices of capital goods, real estate assets, and the securities which represent them and are exchanged on the stock market, where, as you remember, the indexes sold. Curiously enough, like in the roaring years prior to the Great Depression of 1929, the shock of monetary growth has not significantly influenced the prices of the subset of consumer goods and services, which are approximately only 1/3 of all goods, being the other 2/3 mainly capital goods. The last decade, like the 1920s, has seen a remarkable increase in productivity as a result of the introduction on a massive scale of new technologies and significant entrepreneurial innovations, which, were it not for the money and credit injection, would have given rise to a healthy and sustainable reduction in the unit price of the goods and services all citizens consume. Moreover, the full incorporation of the economies of China and India into the globalized market has gradually raised the real productivity of consumer goods and services even further. And the absence of a healthy deflation in the prices of consumer goods in a stage of such considerable growth in productivity as that of recent years provides us with the main evidence that the monetary shock has seriously disturbed the whole economic process. Economic theory teaches us that, unfortunately, artificial credit expansion and the fiduciary inflation of media of exchange offer no shortcut to a stable and sustained economic development, No way of avoiding the necessary sacrifice and discipline behind all high rates of voluntary saving. In fact, particularly in the United States, voluntary saving has not only failed to increase, but in some past years has even fallen to a negative rate. How was it possible to increase investment at 10% per year in the States when savings were not growing or even decreasing? Only because the whole thing was artificially financed through credit expansion. And indeed, the artificial expansion of credit and money is never more than a short-term solution, and that at best. In fact, today there is no doubt about the recessionary quality the monetary shock always has in the long run. Newly created loans of money citizens have not first saved immediately provide entrepreneurs with purchasing power they use in overly ambitious investment projects. In recent years, especially in the building sector and real estate development, 1 million houses built in Spain that nobody wants. In other words, entrepreneurs act as if citizens had increased their saving, when in fact they have not actually done so. Widespread discoordination in the economic system results. The financial bubble, the so-called irrational exuberance, exerts a harmful effect on the real economy. And sooner or later, the process reverses in the form of an economic recession, which marks the beginning of the painful and necessary readjustment. And this readjustment invariably requires the reconversion of the entire real productive structure, which inflation has entirely distorted. The specific triggers of the end of the euphoric monetary binge and the beginning of the recessionary hangover are many, and they can vary from one cycle to another. In the current circumstances, the most obvious triggers have been first the rise in the price of raw materials, remember particularly oil, the subprime mortgage crisis in the United States, and finally the failure of important banking institutions, when it became clear in the market that the value of their debts exceeded that of their assets, which were mainly mortgage loans erroneously granted. At present, you have read it in the press, many self-interested voices are demanding further reductions in interest rates and new injections of money, which permit those who decide to complete their investment projects without suffering any losses. Nevertheless, this escape forward would only temporarily postpone problems at the cost of making them far more serious later. The crisis has hit because the profits of capital goods companies, especially in the building sector and real estate development, have disappeared due to the entrepreneurial errors committed in the past and provoked by cheap credit, and because the prices of consumer goods have begun to perform in relative terms less poorly than those of capital goods. At this point, it is inevitable, a painful readjustment that begins by a drop in production and an increase in unemployment. The most rigorous economic analysis and the coolest, most balanced interpretation of recent economic and financial events lead inexorably to the conclusion that central banks, which I repeat are true financial central planning agencies, cannot possibly succeed in finding the most convenient monetary policy at every moment. This is exactly what became clear, as you know, in the case of the failed attempts to plan the former Soviet economy from above. Exactly the same is happening now in the Western world regarding the financial system. To put it in another way, the theory of the economic impossibility of socialism, discovered by Mises and Hayek, is fully applicable to central banks in general, and to the Federal Reserve, and at one time Alan Greenspan, and nowadays Ben Bernanke in particular. According to this theorem, it is impossible to organize society in terms of economics based on coercive commands issued by a planning agency. For years, they have shirked away their monetary responsibility, and now they find themselves in a blind alley. They can either allow the recessionary process to follow its path, and with it the healthy and painful readjustment, or they can escape forward toward a renewed inflationist cure. With the latter, the chances of even more severe recession, even a stagflation or inflationary recession in the not too distant future increase exponentially. And this was precisely the error committed following the stock market crash of 1987. Furthermore, the reintroduction of a cheap credit policy at this stage could only hinder the necessary liquidation of unprofitable investments and company reconversion. It could even wind up prolonging the recession indefinitely, as occurred with the Japanese economy, which after all possible interventions were tried, ceased to respond to any stimulus involving credit expansion or Keynesian methods. It is in this context of financial schizophrenia that we must interpret the shots in the dark fired in the last 2 years by the monetary authorities, who, remember, have two totally contradictory responsibilities, both to control inflation and to inject all the liquidity necessary into the financial system to prevent its collapse. Thus, one day, the Federal Reserve, remember, rescued American International Group, Bear Stearns, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Citigroup. And the next day, it allows Lehman Brothers to fail under the amply justified pretext of teaching a lesson and refusing to fuel moral hazard. Finally, in light of the way events were unfolding, the American and European governments launched multi-billion-dollar plans to purchase illiquid and worthless assets from the banking system, or even to buy the bank shares, nationalizing totally or partially the private banking system. Under the current circumstances, the most appropriate policy would be to liberalize the economy at all levels, especially in the labor market, to permit the rapid reallocation of productive factors to profitable sectors. Likewise, it is essential to reduce public spending and taxes in order to increase the available income of heavily indebted economic agents who need to repay their loans as soon as possible. Essential to this aim is also to have a very flexible labor market and a much more austere public sector. These factors are fundamental if the market is to reveal as quickly as possible the real value of the investment goods produced in error, and thus lay the foundation for a healthy, sustainable economic recovery. This morning, I made some comments on the bad influence of the new accounting rules in the current situation, but I will not repeat what I said. I have written several articles on that money, and you can read them in the internet. And I finish. Thank you very much for the message. If we want to get rid of real socialism in the monetary and credit sector, I mean to get rid of central banks, and if we want to create a truly free and stable financial and monetary system in this new 21st century, it will be necessary to take 3 steps, which I discuss extensively in my book, 850 pages long. I recommend you, all of you, to not to read, to study with 2 colors and comment. Which are these 3 steps that should be taken? First one, the reestablishment of a 100% reserve requirement on all bank demand deposits and equivalents. And regarding this first step, I'm very proud that 2 members of the British Parliament, Douglas Carswell and Stephen Baker, mentioned my name last September the 15th as the inspirator of the banking reform they are proposing through a bill that will be discussed on November the 19th, 1 month from now. The second step that will be needed is the elimination of central banks as lenders of last resort, because they will be not necessary if the preceding principle is applied. And also, they will be harmful if they continue to act as financial central planning agencies. And third, the the third step of the reform I proposed in my book is the privatization of the current monopolistic and fiduciary state issue money and its replacement with a monetary system that cannot be manipulated by humans, like, for instance, the classic gold standard. This radical, definitive reform would essentially mark the culmination of the 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall and real socialism, since this reform would mean the application of the same principles of liberalization and private property to the only field, that of finance and banking, which has until now remained mirrored in central planning through central banks. Extreme interventionism, for instance, remember the fixing of interest rates, the tangled web of government regulation, and a state monopoly through legal tender laws which require the acceptance of the current state issue fiduciary money. All these considerations are crucially important in light of the critical state of the current international financial system. Nevertheless, and as I said this morning, while it is tragic that we have arrived at the current situation, it is even more tragic, if possible, the widespread lack of understanding regarding the true causes of the phenomena that plague us, and especially the atmosphere of confusion and uncertainty prevalent among the expert analysts and most economic theorists, most of my colleagues. In this area, at least, I can hope that the different editions of my book on money, bank credit, and economic cycles, Moneda, Creditul Bancar și ciclurile economice, and which are presented today to all of you, let us hope, I say, that this book may contribute to the theoretical training of the readers, to the intellectual rearmament of the new generations, and eventually to the so much needed institutional redesign of the entire monetary and financial system of current market economies. If this hope is fulfilled, I will not only view the effort made as worthwhile, but will also deem it a great honor to have contributed even a very small step to move in the right direction. Thank you very much. Two lectures in one, right?